Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, our first episode in a week of special coverage marking October 7th. And we're starting with the media.
Many books will be written about the Gaza genocide, and it's important to understand how the story is being told as it is unfolding.
After 2 years of Israel's war on Gaza and growing consensus that it's committing genocide, is Western media coverage catching up? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Before we go on with today's episode, I need to ask for your support. The Take is nominated for the Signal Awards in the Best Daily Podcast category, and Al Jazeera's True Crime Reports is nominated for Most Innovative Video Podcasts and Best True Crime Podcasts. So while we wait for the judges' decisions, you can help us with the listeners' vote. The links for voting are included in this episode's description, so head there after this and vote. Thank you.
My name is Assal. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., a historian by training, and my specialty is in the modern Middle East, Iran, and Israel-Palestine.
Well, Assal, welcome to The Take. It's really good to have you. You have come to be known by the no-nonsense moniker of headline fixer for a while now. It's even in your Instagram bio. So the headlines that you have been fixing for the past 2 years have mainly been about Israel's genocide in Gaza, even if it hasn't actually been called that. For those who haven't seen your signature red slashes online, what does that look like and why do you do it?
As a historian, one of the things we study is narrative. It's how the story is told. It's how historical stories are told. And right now, we're witnessing history in real time. This will be something that is studied for decades to come. Many books will be written about the Gaza genocide. And it's important to understand how the story is being told as it is unfolding. And so that's why I look at headlines. I mark the part that probably doesn't fit or is not telling the story correctly, and then add just a word or two. In some cases, sometimes it requires a little bit more work, but often you can correct a headline with just a few words. And part of the exercise is in showing that the language that is used by Western media is deliberate and that it doesn't actually require a lot of editing in order to convey a completely different message.
I have to say, as someone who went to journalism school, it's given me flashbacks to being in those classes with that red pen. So can you give us an example of some recent headlines you've had to fix?
If you look at the way that the headlines are, the first thing is, does it give you the basics? Does it tell you, the what, the who, the why, the when? You would think that is the basic components of conveying a message. And yet oftentimes that is completely missing from a headline. A recent New York Times editorial, I think it was, "This terrible war must end." And that was the headline of the editorial. So this terrible war must end doesn't really give you which war are you referring to, framing it as a war when it's a genocide, which has been concluded by the world's leading experts, the world's leading human rights organizations, multiple UN Commission reports, and the most recent report from the UN that says Israel has committed genocide. And the key component that is often missing, and that was in this particular headline, is Israel. There's no mention of the actor. There's no mention of who is responsible for this genocide, who is carrying it out. And that has been a consistent pattern throughout these last 2 years. So when I see something like that, my immediate response is to think, well, let's first name the actor. Let's name the correct action and who is it being done to.
Okay, so you mentioned the New York Times, but I've seen you correct the AP, BBC. There are others.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that is pervasive across all legacy mainstream Western media. I'm not talking necessarily about medias in other places of the world, because those are the states that are supporting Israel. These are Israel's allies. And so what they're doing is they're taking the word of Israeli officials, US officials, of governments, and they're essentially parroting them or repeating them, acting more as stenographers than journalists. I mean, journalism is about seeking the truth, not just saying, well, this is what states say, especially in the Western world that champions this idea of the free press. That's what I think makes it particularly egregious. And in the case of the New York Times, why do I focus so much on the New York Times? One, because they're terrible. They have some of the most bizarre headlines that we've seen that I've seen at least in this period have come from the New York Times. And it's the notoriety. It's the fact that when you hear the New York Times, you think, well, this is the paper of record. This is such a well-known media institution in the United States and often well-respected. They boast about the multiple Pulitzer Prizes that they've won, all of this acclaim. And yet this is the institution that I think has done potentially the worst job at actually telling you what is happening. And if you go back to April of 2024, there's a leaked memo that The Intercept runs, a story about how the New York Times gives a memo to instruct its reporters on what words not to use or what language to avoid. And not surprisingly, it's words like genocide, occupation, refugee camp, Palestine, all of these types of words. And if you look at the New York Times, that's precisely the language that's missing. When I look back at sort of early cases there's so many, it's hard to remember. Well, one that sticks out, and again, this comes from the New York Times. It was in November of 2023, so it was very early in the genocide. There was a headline that said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit maybe, but it said something to the effect of explosion, Gazans say was airstrike, leaves casualties in densely populated neighborhood. So think about how much is missing from this. First of all, there's no mention of Israel. Palestinians are Gazans. And it's not to say that, and this is a really important point, it's not to say that Gazans are not a unique identity or subculture within the Palestinian national identity. But when you're dealing with a public audience that doesn't necessarily know this, they might not understand that Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem are all Palestinian territories and all part of the larger movement for Palestinian liberation. So you have that. There's no mention of killed, right? That verb is not used. It's just, it leaves casualties. So it wasn't even good English, to be completely honest. And that's something that you see sometimes where there's so many words to avoid a very concise sentence that could have been Israeli airstrike kills dozens of civilians in Gaza. It's not that they don't have the ability or the space to do it. It's that when they have the space, they try to make it so convoluted that for a minute you have to reread the headline in order to understand what happened. So that was a really early one. And I'll just mention one more, because this one always sticks out to me. There was a headline in New York Times in March of 2024 that said, lives ended in Gaza. And this was when the official Gaza ministry death toll had reached 30,000 Palestinians killed.
Wow.
Anybody who's listening or anybody who's watching, when have you said lives ended? Like, when is that how we talk about people being killed on a mass scale? And by the way, by March of 2024, we had already had the ICJ case against Israel. And there were experts saying this is a textbook case of genocide. So that's the context in which that was the headline.
Okay, so we've mentioned genocide a few times now, and I just want to go there. You touched on it earlier, but one of the most contentious issues in many newsrooms has been what to call Israel's actions in Gaza. And so I know what that's looked like as a member of this industry that you critique, but I'm wondering, what do you think of how outlets are handling that terminology, and why does it matter?
I think it's genocide denial. I don't know that there's another way you can put it. And it's not that they don't know. I think that's one of the most frustrating things. Of course, everybody knows because there's a mounting body of evidence, and there has been for some time. I mean, Human Rights Watch calls it a genocide. I think it was December of 2024. Amnesty says the same thing. Again, we've had multiple UN reports. Roz Siegel, who is an Israeli historian and expert on genocide, called it a textbook case of genocide within days. This was October 13th, 2023. What is he basing it on? The genocidal language of Israeli officials.
We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
And I think that when you look at the overall picture of the coverage in the last 2 years, that is the most egregious act of Western media is to simply not call it what it is. They'll say, well, such and such organization has accused Israel of genocide. Israel denies this. It's like, well, states committing genocide don't say they're committing genocide. So it's a very bizarre sort of both sides way of presenting information rather than, again, presenting the truth. What is happening?
Okay, break down. I want a little University Class 101 here. Break down for me what you believe people see when they see that denial in the same headline, because the denial is a fact. Israel does deny this. But when it's coupled with the fact of what happened, what does that do to the viewer, to the listener? What happens?
Well, when you platform the fact that Israeli officials deny this, in the same breath that you're presenting, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN says Israel's committing genocide, you're giving equal value, equal validity to these two claims. And they're not equally valid. And so the entire point of the international bodies and institutions that we created in the wake of World War II was to hold states accountable. But when you present it that way, they're validating these claims. And most importantly, they're casting doubt on the very institutions that were created and built to prevent a genocide from happening. It's almost as if they're waiting for Israel to complete its genocide before they will call it that. And that's not the point of the UN's, genocide convention.
We'll have more with Assal after the break.
A young woman killed a stranger in South Korea because of her obsession with true crime stories. Her curiosity for dark tales became a deadly impulse to try out one of her own. Is the media responsible? Does true crime harm more than it helps? Hear the full story on True Crime Reports.
So we're talking a lot about bias today, but there are scholars of journalism who say there is no such thing as objectivity. Everything is subjective to the perspective either the organization or of the journalist, which means that there's a responsibility on the consumer to read between the lines. So what are your tips for people who want to be critical news consumers and keep that in mind as they learn about what's happening?
Yeah, I can agree with the idea that everyone, myself included, we all have an inherent bias. And it's, even as a scholar, you have to be cognizant of that fact and sort of admit it. And so that's important. But we have levels of bias. But in terms of, reading between the lines, what I would suggest, is expand what you are reading. Read independent papers and follow independent media. Look at non-Western media. There should be an array of things that you're reading. And then, in terms of reading between the lines, look at the language that they're not using and ask, why aren't they using that language?
Well, Assal, it is not lost on me that we are having this conversation that sometimes might feel like we're preaching to the choir, because you are on Al Jazeera and our viewers, our people, if they've gotten this far in, are likely ones who sought out this type of coverage. But I wonder if you think, by that same token, people should read more Israeli media, get it straight from the source of whatever it is that they're reading about.
I actually think that's a great idea. If to the extent that people have the time to dedicate to learning more about something or having a larger perspective of what's going on, I actually think Israeli media is really important to read because you're seeing that perspective. There are things that are happening within Israel that Western media completely ignores. You got a report in the New York Times that admitted this, that Netanyahu has sabotaged ceasefire talks this entire time. But that's been the case for over a year. If you just followed Western media, you're thinking, well, Israel has agreed to this. It's just Hamas that's the obstacle to peace, when there's a completely different reality. And that is something you actually see within Israeli media, because it's following more of the day-to-day of what is happening there.
Well, despite the pro-Israel slant that you're talking about in the U.S., most American voters now oppose sending military and economic support to Israel, and support for Israel is at its lowest in 25 years. In your view, what is driving that shift?
That is a great point. One reason was Palestinian journalists. Palestinian journalists are why anything has shifted. Because in risking their own lives, I mean, you have unprecedented slaughter of journalists at the hands of Israel in the last 2 years. But Palestinian journalists on the ground are the ones that are giving us this information. That combined with social media, the fact that they can get this message out. And I think it's just the volume of atrocity, the volume of daily horror that has been streamed to our devices for 2 years that has finally broken through the propaganda machine that exists in the West, especially in the United States, because people cannot see these images and reconcile them in their minds to justify them. You cannot see children being slaughtered every day and try and actually justify it. And that's why we're seeing a shift.
Mm. You so rightly put that shift on the shoulders of these incredibly courageous Palestinian journalists. And I wonder if it were not also for the proliferation of social media and the fact that we're seeing so much of this, the destruction and the bravery in the palm of our hands via these social media apps. Do you think that that is linked hand in hand?
Absolutely. And that's why Israel doesn't like the social media apps, right? That's why you see, public declarations from Netanyahu himself.
We have to fight with the weapons that apply to the battlefields in which we're engaged. And the most important ones are the social media. And the most important purchase that is going on right now is followers. TikTok, number one.
And so you see the struggle over TikTok and the fact that you have pro-Israel billionaires who want to take over TikTok. The increased kind of suppression of content on whether it's Meta, whether it's Twitter X. Social media is extremely important because it is the conduit for getting this information out. So it's really important, and we know it's important because Israeli officials want to control that narrative on social media platforms.
Mm. Well, you tweeted about this. So beyond headlines, that narrative is being controlled also in person. And so you've shared your take online. And I'm hoping you can share it here too, because we know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gathered a bunch of social media influencers and content creators not too long ago at the Israeli consulate in New York. And he encouraged them to use TikTok, to use X to increase international support for Israel. And as you said, he called social media one of the most important weapons. I'm wondering, do you think that will work?
I think for a long time it did. I was in undergrad when we would deal with people that would come to campus and Hasbara, and the fact that you had basically Israel has like a budget for propaganda, what they call public diplomacy. I mean, you're paying people to be on campuses, to be in different areas, to propagate a very specific narrative that says Israel is always right. Israel can do no wrong. And that's where you get these sort of like sound bites. Has everyone basically on this planet now heard the phrase, Israel has the right to defend itself?
I think many would share my view that Israel has a right to defend itself.
People keep saying Israel has the right to defend itself. And then whenever Israel does, they object to it.
Yet it's so odd because the notion of self-defense is enshrined in international law, and that means every country has the right to defend. Every people has a right to defend themselves. And yet that language is you never hear something like Lebanon has the right to defend itself, even though it was invaded by Israel. So those are the kinds of sound bites that get said over and over again until they become truth. And it works through these different sort of prongs of propaganda that they use. Now social media, the power of social media has been seen over the last 10 years, really, in changing the whole political landscape of the way that we talk about things.
Well, finally, Assal, there's been a staggering amount of death on and after October 7th, 2023. And you mentioned that among those casualties are so many Palestinian journalists, many of them my colleagues from Al Jazeera. So I know how devastating that has been on my little slice of the industry, but I'm wondering what it's felt like and what it means for the consumer on your end. What impact has the killing of so many journalists and so much death overall had on news audiences?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is we've seen a decline in the footage that's coming from Gaza. And that's not by accident. It's not because people are not being killed every single day. And Israel has sort of found this formula of, well, if we kill between, 80 and 90 people a day, no one will really pay attention or care. And that is how the media has helped to normalize literally daily massacres. I mean, when you kill 100 people in a day, that's a massacre. That is a lot of people being killed in one day. And that has declined greatly, in part because you have less and less journalists on the ground. I mean, I felt as an observer, and this is anecdotal, obviously, but still, I felt a decline just after the assassination of Anas al-Sharif. And you didn't ask this, but I still think I want to mention it, is because we were talking about Western media. And I think I said the most egregious thing they've done is not calling what's happening by its name, which is genocide. Mm-hmm. Number 2 on that list to me is how they have failed Palestinian journalists, their own colleagues. If you were a journalist, what the precedent that Israel is setting for what was already a dangerous job, you can just target and murder journalists now for doing their job. I mean, it's terrifying that that this threshold has been crossed. And I saw, in August, this is just a few weeks ago, the double tap attack on Nasser Hospital that targeted journalists. Yeah. When I saw the headlines from Associated Press and Reuters, both of which had journalists that were killed, I mean, Reuters had a headline. One of their journalists was killed. This was on tape. There's a video of this happening. There's no denial that clearly there had already been an attack. You had press and rescue workers there, and you saw a second bomb hit live on TV. And they still ran a headline that said, Israel says they weren't targeting journalists. They killed their own journalists, and this is how it's being covered. So there have been very few condemnations from individual journalists. There have been some. I'm not going to say there's been none. But overall, it is an absolute failure to have not repeatedly condemned and called out what is happening, what Israel is doing. They're murdering journalists with total impunity.
Assal, it's a heavy way to end this conversation, but I don't know any other way. Thank you for calling it out. Thank you for taking your red pen and fixing the headlines that need fixing. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, for your coverage of everything. And it is definitely a heavy note to end on. But like you said, I don't know that there's a light way to end a discussion about a genocide.